Welcome to another video, folks. Now, to start this project, we're going to be creating some damage on the Zimmerit just to make these guys look cool and different. Each tank but a little bit different from the next. Now, we're using a rotary tool, so you've got to be careful with your own fingers when you're doing this, folks. These things move really fast, and you can see I am using it to wear away the Zimmerit. I'm not gouging into the plastic because plastic's really soft, so I'm just wearing it down until I've got a flat surface underneath, taking care if there's an open edge. We don't want to, that's very easy to gouge into and leave an uneven edge, and also any little objects, be careful not to remove them at the same time. It's just the Zimmerit we're wanting to remove. And then to start cleaning things up, I'm going to use a knife. This one's a little bit blunt. I find that's always safer to work with these kind of jobs. I'm scraping away again, looking to make the surface flat where it might be a little bit uneven, get rid of any large lumps or burrs that may be left by the tool, because not everything's going to come off. Though it is very messy, this process, folks, so you're going to have to do a bit of dusting before you do any kind of painting. And then we're going to use some liquid cement. This is very thin liquid cement, and you can see there straight away how it's smoothing things out, and I'll give you a good idea of how smooth you've actually got the exposed surface, and if you need to maybe use the knife to work it a little bit more. There you go, looking very nice, looking very different from before. And you can also drill some shell impacts. And I'm using the same tool as I used to remove the Zimmerit. I'm not trying to push all the way through. Even if I wanted something to go all the way through, the plastic's too thick. And once again, I'll use the thin cement to just round off the edges of that hole, and it'll look much more like a shell impact. And here is the finished example, ready to go. The tracks are removable so that we can airbrush them and paint them separately. I've not videoed the airbrushing of the base colours because it's pretty dull. It's just basically spraying on this new Tamiya XF88 dark yellow 2, and also some Vallejo olive drab. First of all, the tracks. Well, painting these tracks can be a bit of a chore at the best of times. Painting them whilst they're on the tank, that is also a fiddly chore, so I've airbrushed them with some olive drab, which is my base colour for tracks, and then airbrushed the dark yellow on. So that means they'll need a bit of a tidy up, but that'll all be done, and any washing, weathering or such like, that'll all be done separately from the main hull, because these will glue very nicely onto the sides of the tanks without any fit issues, and make life a lot easier. Now, you'll notice that the dark yellow on the wheels is a lot greener compared to the hulls. That's because I only gave it a few thin coats, not a full set of thin coats of the dark yellow. It's going to make them look a bit messier. Hold on, I'll see if I can do this one-handed. Especially once there's a bit of a wash and a bit of a weather on them, they'll have a different look to the hull, which I do like, for showing the difference between the upper and the more weathered lower hull, so I like that. The dark yellow too, I also like. I wanted to get this because dark yellow's quite yellow, quite dark, especially on a 1/100th scale, and I always added some buff to it to lighten it down and give it a bit, maybe even a bit more of a flatter kind of tone. This is very similar to what I would aim for in my dark yellow. You're probably not seeing this. I mean, the lighting here is a bit too blue, shall we say? So you're not seeing this in the correct colour. They are still much more yellow than you're seeing here, but they're not as dark, not as saturated as the normal dark yellow. I can't remember the number. The normal dark yellow. So I'm going to video rather, the airbrushing of the camo colours. That's probably much more interesting than me just going spray, 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 spray. Believe me, that's, from a personal experience, pretty dull. From a viewer's experience, I'd imagine it's even more dull. So we'll move on to that now. We're going to be using, one second, I'm going to be using red brown and olive green. So let's get started. I always start with the brown element of the camo. In this example I'm painting some thin lines. Going over features on a tank is really important. Sometimes you have to go over the line one way and then come back the other way because there'll be shadows where the paint will not reach if you just spray it from one direction. You may notice me there also cleaning the nozzle as I go, and the reason for that is this red brown's a bit annoying. It's not playing today, and you can see some sputtering on the flat surface of the turret top there. But this is not an expensive airbrush, guys, and you can see it's getting some nice lines. You don't have to spend a fortune on an airbrush to get this kind of result, you know, if you're a wargame modeler and you're not doing super fancy blending and such likes. And also another important point to mention here is muscle memory. You'll notice that we're making quite dramatic turns and movements with the brush in very small spaces. You're only going to get that with practice. You need to be moving your hand very, very quick in a very controlled way. A lot of inexperienced airbrushers, you'll see them painting things pretty much in stripes, and that's because they're not moving around over the surface as they go. The rear area's got a lot of detail you need to work around. And the barrel, don't forget top and bottom. And it's starting to come together. Here I'm putting on some blotches. Easier to do than lines, but once again you have to get the right muscle memory so you're getting the correct shape. You need interesting shapes, and you need to leave enough space for the base colour to look the way you want it to be. Always remember that when you're covering up a lot of base colour. And then onto the green, and it's pretty much the same again, watching those shadows that your airbrush cannot get to from one side. You notice here I am spraying it with the turret off on this example. This is another way you can do it, and then put the turret back on and continue those lines up the turret. This is my preferred option, to be honest. And here's the green blotches, so you can see me filling in the spaces, giving some consideration to the base camo and how much I want there to be. Putting some of the blotches up against the brown. And it's just practice, once again folks, muscle memory, and getting your eye in to see what patterns are effective, look historical and look good. So there you go folks, that's the airbrushing done. Tamiya red brown folks, it's my absolute red bane, never mind red brown. It's it was getting very dry coming out the needle. You could see spots like little lumps over spray and such likes. I have good days or bad days with it. Today wasn't the worst day, but it wasn't a good day either. But you can see there's a few different kinds of camo schemes for a bit of variety, and they're now ready for some gloss varnish. I have prepared the tracks as well. I've repainted any overspray from the dark yellow and then give them a dry brush of metal. So I'll get everything gloss varnished, ready for the next stage, which will be the washes. For the washes we're going to be using enamel. It's it's a wash which has got a very low surface tension, which means you can direct it into all the little nooks and crannies and all the areas that you want to be shaded, whilst not having it resting on the higher areas you want to be left lighter. That's one reason why the gloss varnish was applied at this stage, so that when we're applying the wash it will flow nicely into recesses, and the gloss varnish will allow us to brush off any excess. But I'm going to start with the tracks. I'm going to use a brown wash for this. There are lots and lots of these kind of washes out there. I don't particularly recommend any one over another. You really just got to try them and see what you think. Now for this is going to be very, very, very simple. We're just going to take this very thin wash, as you can see. Hopefully you can see that. Very thin. Whoops, that's too much. Right, but it's very easy to spread it around, see. We don't need to be careful when we're washing the running gear here, because we want it to look muddy. We want it to look dark. Don't let it pool too much in any one place. But at the same time, you can be, you can build up sort of variation in it. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. So I'm going to let that dry now. That's as simple as that, really. And when I'm letting it dry, I'm going to lie it flat so that the wash settles. If you stand it upright, this is very, very fluid. As I said, it will run to the bottom. And you don't want that. You just want it to settle as it is. If your tracks are on your tank, then sit the tank up on its side. It will settle top and bottom, if you see what I mean. It won't fall off the bottom if they were like this. It's not going to fall off and it will settle, but when I do that I typically turn it over after a few minutes. But that's it as far as the tracks go. I'm going to wash the Zimmerit first, let it settle so it's quite dry, and then I can wash the other features. Because the whole surface of the sides is going to have thinner and wash on it, I don't want to tackle the other bits until I'm sure things are dry enough to work. So I've got some thinner in here. That's a product, a modelling product. Putting a couple of brush loads into here, just so they've got a decent amount of thinner on the palette. I'm going to be using this wash here. This is dark wash. You'll notice it's, can I get it in the shot, folks? It's solidly stuck onto this thing by some blue tack, so that you don't accidentally knock it over. As you know, with washes, it happens to everybody. At some point you're going to knock your bottle of wash over, so I use some blue tack on this and it keeps it nice and steady for normal kind of handling. So I'm taking just a brush full of paint. If I can get that in shot. That's me just dip the brush into the bottle and put it in a thinner. Do it again. Right, and that's us ready. Now you can see how thin that is. It's basically like water. It's really just thinner with a little bit of black in it. But that's what we need it for, because especially on the Zimmerit, we don't want to be drowning this thing or painting it black. That's the worst thing you could do. So hopefully you can see that just running over the surface when I'm touching the brush. and just going down into the recesses and giving us a nice fine grid effect that we need for a good looking Zimmerit. Doing the same again. The trick is always to be conscious of how much wash there is in this thinner. Give it a little stir if it's not really looking as though it's doing anything. But also be careful if it looks like it's too thick. It's very easy to start painting things black when you're doing these washes, folks. Now just drawing some off where it's too heavy, and then I'll leave it to settle. Move on to the next bit. Let's do the front plate for the driver and radio operator. I'm not using brown for this, by the way. Brown wouldn't shade the brown camouflage very well, or the green, to be honest. And it would change the tone of the yellow quite dramatically. Just giving it a wee stir there, keep it active. The wash will go to the bottom. Black kind of makes yellow go green, gives it a greenish tint, which is pretty much what we're after, to be honest. Whereas brown will just make it look brown, and you'll end up with a brown tank as opposed to a yellow tank. So, oops, sorry, get it in shot. Try to get some more light on it. But there you go, that's it applied. We can now leave that for a bit to settle whilst we do a turret. Just tapping it on again. See, now that's going on quite thick, so I'm taking some of this thinner that I've got here with a view to just thinning that down a bit. We don't want this being really strong. We don't want to paint it black, folks. You just want to apply a bit of shade. Okay, so that's the Zimmerit on the turret done. So I'm going to just take a bit of tissue paper and dry that off. Take some of this thinner. It's got a little bit of paint in it, but not much. And I'm just going to have a check and just try and thin down the areas of exposed base colour. Take some of the dirty thinner off the brush. And we're just trying to get rid of any areas that are too dark. And this dark yellow, we just really want a shadow effect on that, and more of a distinct shade effect on the brown and green. I'm not going to add extra shade to the brown and green, they've got enough. I just want to lighten the yellow a bit. Then let's go back to the turret. Do the same, clean the brush off a bit. And there we go. That's the Zimmerit shaded, but we've not got a really black looking tank. So next we will do a pin wash. So this paint here is getting a bit thick because the wash is settled to the bottom. I can always add more thinner, and if required more wash, and just keep working. So, see, that needs more wash now. If you're going to have this bottle sitting for a while, give it a shake, because the enamel element of the wash will just drop down to the bottom, sink down to the bottom. Now, the engine grills. I want to be very heavy on this. And the chances are you're going to have to come back and do them twice. You don't really want to have light areas and dark areas in here. The recesses should all be dark. Okay, there's a lot going on in the engine deck of a Tiger tank. So this is us getting more into the pin wash side of things. So I'm just going to touch the brush to the features and let capillary action draw the wash around. So we'll speed things up here, folks, but you can see me applying the wash, and then straight away I'm going to use some thinner to draw any excess off flat surfaces and into features. So I'm not going to necessarily draw the excess off the vehicle, but I could draw into a hatch or into a panel line and then keep working it, and that way it reduces the chances of getting a very dark overall finish to the vehicle. We're ready to do the highlights, and there's usually 2 stages to the highlights, and the highlights are also the foundation of the chipping that we'll do. The first stage of the highlights is what I call the outside edges. These are areas that are easy to reach with the side of a brush. Now, this is not dry brushing. The paint is quite wet on the brush. You're not drawing a dry brush along, or you end up with a dry finished look, which is not what we want. And you'll notice that I'm not hitting the entire length of each edge, because we can highlight the edge without making the whole edge just jump out at you. Now, I am using Iraqi sand for this, sorry folks, Iraqi sand. That's my go-to colour. Now, talking about outside edges, for instance, here's an outside edge, just and no more. I can highlight this without worry of touching the panels or the Zimmerit. And you see, once again, I'm just kind of bouncing the brush along the edge. You'll notice if it's too dry, because the paint won't flow off it. For instance, there it's not coming off. So refresh the brush a little, take off any excess moisture, and then just bounce the brush along. Take care in the darker areas where there's camo that you're putting a smaller amount of highlight colour. And then we'll just bounce along here, bounce along here. And you see, at this point we're really just sticking to outside edges. But bear in mind, when you're approaching the figure with your brush, that the highlight is going to go on an edge that is visible when the tank's on the table, so to speak. If you go like that, and start highlighting it because it's easy to catch the edge and not make a mistake. When you turn over, you won't see the highlight, so make sure you've got the right angle of approach, so to speak. And then you can also start hitting this top edge very carefully because this Zimmerit, there's a lot going on with the Zimmerit. You just want to catch the top edge at the moment. Same with the front. And what I'll do is turn it over. See, it's getting dry again. We don't want a dry brush. We want some highlights painted on. And now there's a wee mistake, but that's fine. At this stage it's not a worry because we're going to go back and do our chipping, and it's just going to be one of the points that we do some heavy chipping on. As long as you don't do too many mistakes like that, you're fine. This feature here can also be picked out, and hopefully it's coming across okay on the camera. That's now becoming a lot more visible. It's set into the shade, making it pop out. So we'll speed things up again, and you can see me hitting those external edges, bouncing the brush along. It's not about, as I said, a solid line. And you can see that on the turret here because it's got some dark edges. And they've got smaller areas that have got external edges that we can also do. We can carefully draw the brush around. And then we're ready for some internal shading. So here is where I've got to take more care. This is where I have to work around objects and get thin lines painted on edges. Some of them are flat edges, some of them are sharp edges that are easier to do than others. But this all takes patience. That's one of the most important things. And on a tank like a Tiger, it can be really demanding because there are so many little details. But patience is the thing to keep it all in balance so that you don't end up with something which has got more highlight than base colour. We're hitting the inside edges of items, features, that you can see. These are things that take a bit more time, and it's not as easy as just edge lining. And we're creating the shapes of panels as well. You'll notice me doing along the edge of the top panel for the turret, or the top rather of the turret. And we just keep working along nice and patient. So the highlighting has been completed, and we're next ready to do the chipping. Now we're going to be using light chips, which is Iraqi sand again, and dark chips, which is German Camo Black Brown. But the most important thing to remember about chipping is less is more. You can just go crazy and cover the whole thing in marks, which just looks terrible. What we're going to be doing with chipping here is we're going to be showing signs of wear, but we're also going to be breaking up large panels and bringing smaller features into focus. We're going to use light chips on the dark areas and then add dark cores, so to speak, dark centres of light chips into the light areas. So that way you've got the right contrast, and it's not just like a dark chip in a dark area and you're not going to see it. That's just going to waste your time. So I shall get the paint ready. We'll make a start. I'll record this at normal speed and then move on to the speeded up process, just to let you see how the whole thing looks. So it's light chips, excuse me, light chips to start. Let's do this fender here. So we've got to think, what we want to do here. It might have some scuffs along the edges and the corners especially, and then perhaps there's a wee scratch coming off that. Likewise, got to keep that paint flowing, folks, but still, for the thin lines at least, making sure that it's not pooling. Quite often take these little scratches coming out of corners. It looks quite good. Put a bit of chipping in the corner there, maybe a bit in there. Just toughen that up a bit. And that shows just a bit of wear. And then you can also just dot around a couple of marks. And let's see, on here, see tiny little amounts on the hatches, almost like scuff marks. We can draw a scratch across a feature like that, and that helps bring it into focus. This little feature here, I don't know what it's called. Some in here, and you can see I'm moving the brush in different ways at different points to get different looks. Let's speed things up again. So the trick here is, as I was saying, is keeping things nice and random, making sure the paint's flowing off your brush nicely, going where you want it. It's not dragging off the brush but drawing off the brush really nice. And then keeping things in balance, not too much, not too little. We've got this big panel here, for instance, on the top of the turret. Hitting that top edge where the slope starts, and then work around the bottom edges. And then, as you can see, filling in that large area, breaking up that large panel, as well as helping to pick out smaller details such as hatches and periscopes and all these kind of things. The back of the turret bin is also a large area that we can knock up and make a bit more interesting. And that is the light scratches, and you can see how there's a lot more going on there as a result. Once we put the dark scratches in, there'll be even more focus and a bit more depth to what you're seeing. Before we move on to the dark chipping, there's one area we've not given any attention to so far, and that's the Zimmerit. So I don't want to just dry brush this tank, then the look will become really quite different. So what I'm going to be doing to just add a bit of highlight to the Zimmerit is taking a brush which is pretty much dry but not completely dry. I'm just going to be tapping it onto the areas where the dark yellow undercoat is still visible. I'm not dry brushing it as such. I don't want to catch too many edges. I really just want to bring out a bit of just sort of defining height to add to the shade that's there. And as I said, I'm only doing it on those areas where you can see the undercoat, or the base coat rather. So dark chips. I'm using a very, very fine brush for this. And I want to be filling in the centre of the larger light chips. And this represents where bare metal has been exposed and is darkened down, rusted, whatever. Now you can see I'm putting on tiny, tiny little amounts. quite tricky. You really have to make sure that the paint is thin enough to get it off the brush when it's getting put on such small quantities. One thing to note as well with a dark paint on a lighter surface, it also acts as a paint that can edge for you. So you don't always have to accentuate the edge with a light paint, you can accentuate the edge with a dark paint. You can see there that is helping to create the shape. There. Let's keep working on these dark chips, and you can see they're really small, but it's going to help confirm to the eye what it is we're looking at. This is bare metal showing through as a result of wear and damage, and a nice bit of character added to the figure as well. Now the spare track, I'm not painting it with metallic colours. You could just do so, but here I want to stay away from metallic colours. I've used it as a dry brush on the tracks, but I'll be staying away from them otherwise. So I've given us a base coat of German Grey, and then some of the pieces of the track I have given a coat of dark grey, and then a smaller number again, a coat of Basalt Grey, and that gives us a nice variegated surface to work on now, because not all track would be made up of links from the same source, but mainly we're doing this just so that it changes over the surface and it's not too monochromatic, so to speak. So I'm now taking some Panzerisi's Light Rust, and I'm going to apply it as a wash, trying to keep it on the surface more than in the recesses, because I'm now wanting this to look rusty. You can use pigments for this. If you are going to use pigments, I strongly recommend that you mix the pigments as a wash in a palette, just as I'm doing here for this acrylic wash, and then apply it as I'm doing here, very, very sparingly. Don't put dry pigment on and then try and work it on the figure, because the whole front of your tank will become rusty. Okay, so that's a nice rusty look with a nice bit of variation. So what I'm going to do now is just to add to that variation, sorry, wrong pot, I'm taking some Panzerisi's Yellowish Rust. We need a few highlights in here. So let's just lift these teeth out of the background. Catch those pins, make them pop a little bit. Accentuate space between those sections of the track. But in the bottom, just to help frame it, likewise on the side. And then we've got some really nice spare track that didn't actually take too long to paint to get a really nice look, and we didn't have to go into the wonderful world of pigments to achieve a rusty look. We're now ready to detail the hull of the Tiger tank, and there is so much on this. It's a bit daunting, to be honest. You've got the cables at the side that were used for changing tracks. You've got the tow cables, you've got the Pioneer tools, you've got the jack block, towing hooks, machine gun, exhausts, and I've maybe missed something, you never know. So there's a lot in here. I'm not going to show you how to paint every single thing. I'll just record some excerpts of me doing it with a few key points, and all of the colours will be in the description below. So we're going to start with some German Grey. Apply that to all the tools, all the metallic areas. You've got to be careful when you're painting these things to get right around the edges, but don't touch the underlying hull or the surrounding hull. Then we've got so many cables to paint. Once again, these are really tricky to get the paint exactly on it, but only on it. I've put down some base colours on the wood elements. We've got the cleaning rods, we've got the handles, the spade and such like, we've got the jack block. So I've used German Camo Medium Brown here, here, here and here. I've then used flat earth. I've also put a couple of lines of flat earth over the block just to start building up a bit of detail in there. And I'm now going to use Panzer Aces new wood to paint the wooden handles, the main colour for the wooden handles. We're using new wood on the spades, axe, etc., and then little amounts of orange brown on the other wooden features, and that'll make them nice and distinctive. And then London Grey as an edge highlight to all the metal parts. And don't forget there's metal parts on the rear of the tank as well. There's bits everywhere on this. And then some Basalt Grey to go dot 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 dot, as you can see, all the way along the cables to try and create a bit of a cabled look. Off camera I gave every clip a coat of old wood with a little highlight of Iraqi sand, and then the areas that are going to be painted a dark yellow kind of colour I gave a base coat of US Field Drab, and then I'm going to give them a coat of German Camo Beige just to give a contrasting dark yellow kind of colour. You can see on the cables, and then also the fire extinguisher, and on the back you've got the jack, plus I'm not sure if I get this on camera, but in here is the metal base plate for the jack. The jack's quite a complicated piece. There's so many different shapes in here. Just follow it as well as you can, folks. Just try and get the most important areas, and there you go. It's now ready for a highlight, and the highlight will be deck tan. So for instance, here I'm just going to put a highlight down one side, and then just going to catch some of these edges. Just to accentuate the shape bit and not worry too much. So I'll just go and tidy up that finish, like the fire extinguisher and other little bits and pieces, and we're nearly there for detailing. For the exhausts, we're going to be using some Panzerrace's rust colours. I've used dark rust as a base coat. Now I'm going to take some light rust and just, I'm using quite an old, but a very old beat up brush to be honest, because I want to create irregular shapes of rust colours. It's no more complicated than that. And whilst that's even wet, you can go in with some yellowish rust. And add some eye-catching detail. Nothing more to it, than that, folks. Okay, it's time now to do the patches of bare hull. So, we want to be having some hull red visible. First of all, I'll give a really nice battle-worn look and some really nice contrast. Now, Vallejo hull red and other hull reds that I've seen are almost black, and for what I can see historically, could be wrong, but historically hull red is actually a powdery pinkish almost kind of colour, so that's what I went for, and I'm just weathering it down. Here's one here. I've left, the tracks are not fixed, but just so you can see everything in place. It's quite a strong, bold colour, I have to admit. But as a result, it's nice and visible. This is still drying, the wash, because I've added some Glaze medium to the wash. And to get the colour, I mixed some red with a pinkish colour, rose brown. This is how it looks before it's washed. So you can see the wash is dulling it down, and certain areas will be dulled down further. There'll be some weathering added to that because it's near the running gear. So I've used some of the hull red with some Glaze medium, and it's very watery, and the Glaze medium will, the reason for the Glaze medium is it stays wet longer, so I can work it more to create shadows, and it should dry very, very flat, because hull red will be a nice very matte kind of colour. So let's just push some in there. I'm not going to put any into the shell strike, which I've painted with silver to make it nice and bold. This tank has got the most damage to the Zimmerit, so I wanted to use this as the example. And we want to create shadows around the line of the broken Zimmerit. And if this is too bright for you guys, you can just add some of the hull red colour to your pinkish mixture. Just don't use it straight out of the bottles, my advice. But if you know me at Panzerschule, you know I'm going to go bright, and I'm going to look for something with a lot of contrast. It's been drying a couple of minutes, but it's still, you can probably tell from the sheen there probably, yep, it's still really quite wet, but that's not a problem. We're just going to keep keep working it, because I mean glazes are all about wet blending and such like, so let's just keep darkening it down. The whole red has dried, and hopefully you can see it's a really nice flat finish, but at the moment it's still, because there's so much of it especially, it's still very, very red, so we're going to weather it down. We're going to use US Field Drab or more Glaze Medium. Now, just putting this in shot just so you can see what I am all about. So I need a little bit of Field Drab and then just a touch of this medium. If we drown it in medium, it's going to take forever to dry and we're not going to be able to progress very far. And then I'm going to take some of the medium. I mean, you can't really see any on the brush there. Add it to it. Add a bit more and that's us ready to start working. So that's the palette. There's nothing much more than that going on. So I want this lower hull to look as though it's trapped a bit of dirt, because imagine the fender would be sitting on top of this here, angled out. So I am going to add a line of dirt at the top here. Going to make it heavier, quite saturated towards the end because the tracks are going that way and throwing more earth up over there. The glaze medium and a little bit of water is keeping it nice and fluid. So just drawing some of that water off in my hand, and just want to draw some of that down, folks. Need to add a bit more paint. Want to keep it random. And not too stripy. Right, I'll move on to do the next section, then come back to that when it's dried a bit. And then have a bit more saturated at the front. Let's try and toughen this area up a bit, make it look a bit more mucky. Then do my usual. Take the moisture off the brush and draw it to a point. And we're creating a bit of earth that was stuck up there and got a bit wet and streaky. And started to run down. Going back to the palette and just taking a tiny little bit of paint. If it looks too dry, I'm going to take another little bit of glaze medium, add that to it, and I'm just using the lightest of touches, adding more paint. Oopsie, that wasn't a light touch. Take some paint off. I can also do that in my hand. The Glaze medium keeps that paint workable. So if there's any particular areas you're not happy with, just go back, clean the brush again. You can just go back in, reshape and soften. So we've still got the whole red that we want to show off, but it's now weathered down. Streaking and dusting on a 3-tone tank is quite tricky, because if you want to use brown streaks or more sort of light dry dust kind of streaks or patches of dust, it's going to blend into the background camo, which might be okay in a larger scale figure, but it's just going to make everything look soft and indistinct on a smaller scale figure. This one here I did earlier, and I'm going to show you what I did. And I've used London Grey to create some streak and patches of dust. Hopefully it's showing okay on this. It will be softened to a degree by the matte varnish. That's something you've always got to remember with this kind of weathering, folks, when you apply a coat of varnish over it. But it's going to keep that sort of streaky, softened rain mark look, and then around objects it'll have a soft, dusty look, and that's what we're after. So I'll go back to the tank we were working on before, and once again we're going to be using the Glaze medium just to help us out. So we'll add some of that to the palette, so hopefully you can see there, nice and thin, and we'll create some streaks. Now you want to keep these streaks logical, as in following gravity. I actually need to add a bit more paint there. You can see that's a bit too watery. If you put your lines down at the wrong angle, it'll just look weird. And it might sound a bit stupid, but try not to make things look too stripy. Keep the streaks to different lengths. Now, because of the Glaze medium, this is workable in the same way as I would work enamels. See, you can just push these streaks up and down. Make them thinner, make them fatter. And here I actually want to make them a bit fatter. If they're very narrow, with sharp edges, it's a bit too stark. If we did not add the Glaze medium, we would have stopped after just a few seconds of paint there. The Glaze medium allows us to work it, go back to it, see if we like what we've done, and change it accordingly. Now here I want to add a bit of dust at the bottom and the top of the panel. Clean my brush. And then once again we can soften it. Draw it down a bit, or here. Soften it, draw it up a bit. But don't go crazy, folks. Less is most often more. When you're weathering. Right, now we can put some dust around the features on the flat area of the turret. I soon hope to show you some Soviet assault guns that I'll be dusting up with this technique too, so you can see it on a sort of a one colour tank, a monochrome tank. And as that tank is green, I'll be able to use more normal kind of dust colours. So we now need just to soften all this. And take a minute to consider if it's too much or if it's not enough. Now I'm not trying to weather the entire surface. Once again, it's a small kit, and if I was to do that, it would just drown basically in weathering, or I would have to be putting it on and with such levels of control that it's not practical. Just want to get some dust in here. Don't have to worry too much about how it looks, just to keep that overall appearance without going, as I said, over the top. You can put some on these bends, but not too much. Around the base of the hatch, maybe near the hinges. And here's a thought as well, folks. You can use shading to create depth and shape. You can also use light to create depth and shape. A dark area with a light outline is going to stand out. And then we'll be doing the same on the back with some vertical streaks coming down from these hatches, and then perhaps another random one over here. And then just soften it a bit, folks. Soften it, drag it. You can pull up the way as well as down the way, just to get the shape you want. So there you go. It looks a bit stark. As I said, the matte varnish will soften it down a bit to give it a streaky and dusty appearance. I'm also going to apply some of that dust into the chipped Zimmerit. I want this to be very much like a glaze, maybe a little bit of the grey around the edges, but otherwise the surface just greyed down a bit. I'm now going to apply pigments to the tracks, not to anything else, because I don't like the look of pigments at this scale. You've got to be so careful with them. But with the tracks it's okay, you can slap it on. I'm using some MIG pigments here. There's once again lots and lots out there. I just tapped out, not a large amount at all, into this piece of blister, and then put lots of water on. You can see how runny that is. That's what we're needing. We're not putting the pigments onto the figure dry and then working it with water. As you might see in larger scale kits, these kits are too small to do that, and before you know it, you've got too much pigment and you can't work it. The application is really just carefully slap on. Because we're using water here, it's not got the best kind of surface tension, so you will have to work it around and into all the various nooks and crannies in these tracks, of which there are of course lots and lots. So I'm putting it on quite heavy and then moving it around. One thing with pigments, folks, if you think, I've not put too much on, I maybe need to put some more, the best thing to do in that respect is to wait until it's dry, because it can look as though there's not much happening with pigments, but they have quite a strong look when they're dry. And whilst you can always add more if you feel there's not enough, it's extremely difficult to take off dried pigment. Now, I'll turn this around. When I'm working on the inside area of the tracks, I don't want to get any on the wheels. What you find is, because these kits and the wheels and the tracks are all the one mould, is the pigment tends to gather around where it meets, the wheels meet the tracks, and you get little lumps of pigment, which is not attractive. I've already weathered the wheels with a brown wash. I don't need to add pigment to them, so I'm just going to be careful not to leave a little lump of pigments at each point the road wheels contact the track. So it's as simple as that. We're going to let it dry. This looks kind of like mid kind of earth tone, but it will dry quite light. You can mix pigments in to get different results. Practice will tell you if you're getting the right look. I want to go for a light dusty look with these guys. So I'm going to leave these to dry, do some more, and then I'll show them when they're dry and any adjustments we need to make. These are starting to dry. You can see some are not dry. This one is. Now that's only one colour, one pigment. It is possible to add a bit of variety in there, but the question is, do we need to? So I'm just going to take it, try not to drop it, put it in place and have a look and think to myself, is it okay as it is, or do I need to do any more? And I'm quite happy with it. I think what I need to do is just push the pigment around a little bit, any teeth, especially in the back there that have been missed. I'll just move it around and then it's ready for fitting. Now, these pigments are in recessed areas, so you can be confident they're going to stay there. If it was on a flat area, you wouldn't be confident. I'm going to be matte varnishing this to lock it in place. You can use pigment fixers, but bear in mind that if you've got a look you're happy with and then apply pigment fixers to it, the fixer is going to move it. So I prefer just a spray varnish, but if you're going to use a fixer, make sure you're using the fixer at the point at which you're setting the final look and you're happy with it at that point. Otherwise, you know, if you just put it on with water, it's going to rub off. If it's on a flat surface, it's going to be handled a lot. Even with varnish, there's a very good chance it'll also rub off and take the varnish with it, because it's not as solid a surface as paint is. But there you go, I'm quite happy with that, folks. As I said, a little bit of work around the teeth, and they were ready to get glued in place for matte varnish. But before I do any of that, I will do the decals. I'm not going to film that, because that could be a whole new little story in itself. Same with the tank commanders, I'm not going to film that. But we're almost finished. And there's the finished result, folks. To finish things off, what I haven't shown you is the decals, painting off the crew, but the video would just start to take too long. But what I did was I spent a bit of time just removing what I found to be excessive amounts of pigment. It should be in the recesses of the tracks, not sitting covering the details, and it shouldn't be sitting around the base of wheels like a little pool, which it will do just by gravity. So I did that, applied the decals, which went well in some cases and not so well in other cases. I won't go into the detail of the decals too much, folks, but they're done. And then I gave it a coat of gloss varnish, matte varnish, going over the decals a couple of times just to make sure they were nice and dull. And that is then ready to go, ready for the tabletop. So I'm going to be taking some pictures. There will be some stills to come after this, where I've had them in some nice scenic settings. So just a bit of eye candy there to finish things off. Hopefully you liked it. If you've got any questions about what I've done, or why the hell did I do that, then stick it down in the comments and I'll get back to you. And stay tuned for the next one. I hope in terms of tutorials that I will be able to cover the new releases for the German Beige book, as well as maybe some stuff from the Soviet one as well, as I'm getting some things together for that. So thanks again for watching, folks. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all again on the next one.